There's a phrase which Paul uses a few times which has come to be quite controversial in recent discussions, and this shows up in various new translations of the New Testament. In the traditional versions, it used to appear as faith in Jesus Christ, or faith in Jesus the Messiah. I'm thinking, for instance, of a verse like Galatians 2:16, where Paul says, we have believed or had faith in the Messiah Jesus. And then he goes on to say, so that we might be justified, and here's the critical phrase, is it by faith in Christ or by the faithfulness of Christ, and not by works of the law? Now, because of the great debates that took place in the 16th century about faith versus works, everybody in that tradition used to say that what Paul is doing is contrasting our faith with our works. But as people have studied the Greek and have thought about the meaning of various other passages in which this phrase occurs, another option has come to the fore, which on balance I am inclined to take up myself. And that is, because the Greek can mean this, that the word pistis, faith, can be faith as in our faith in or that something or someone, or faithfulness, in which case Paul could be referring to the faithfulness of Jesus, the faithfulness of the Messiah. In other words, Jesus' own faithful life, including particularly his obedient death, which Paul describes in terms of obedience in Romans 5 and in Philippians 2, so that we now have quite a finely balanced question. In passage after passage in Galatians 2 and 3, and in Philippians 3, and in Romans 3, is Paul talking primarily about something that God has done in and through the faithfulness of Jesus for our benefit, or is it about the faith with which we reach out and grasp what has been done? For me, the crucial passage is Romans 3. In Romans 3, Paul is talking about the problem that faces the Jewish people despite the fact that they have been called by God to be the people who bring the light to the nations. And he says, what is the advantage of being a Jew? What's the value of circumcision? Much in every way, because to begin with, he says, they were entrusted with the oracles of God. That's Romans 3, verse 2. And the word for entrusted is very similar to the word for faith, because in English we have faith, faithfulness, trust, loyalty, but in Greek it tends all to come down to this word pistis, or the verb pisteuo. And so when Paul says they were entrusted with the oracles of God, he goes on at once, well, supposing some were untrustworthy. In other words, he seems to be saying, God gave the Jewish people his oracles for the nations, but they were untrustworthy. They didn't pass the message on. They were not actually a light to the nations. Instead, the nations looked at them and scorned their God, as he says in chapter 2. So the problem then is, what is God going to do? If his plan always involved faithful Israel bearing his light to the nations, and if Israel has said, no, we're not going to do that, or not do it in the way that you wanted, is God then going to say, well, we'll forget that plan and do something else instead? Now, here's a problem. Many, many Christians in the Western Church over the years have said, yep, that's exactly what God has done. He's written the Jews out of the plan, and he's got a plan B called Jesus instead. That's exactly wrong. In Romans 3, 21, 22, 23, Paul picks up that train of thought and says, this is how God's faithfulness to the covenant has been revealed, through the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. In other words, the Jewish people were called to be faithful to God's plan, and the faithful obedience which Jesus as Messiah has offered, instead of being the denial of the Jewish plan and its God-givenness, is its fulfillment. So that now in Romans 3:22 he says, God's covenant faithfulness has been unveiled, and it's witnessed to by the law and the prophets, and it's the covenant faithfulness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. But this doesn't mean, of course, that human faith is irrelevant, because he goes on to say in the next breath, for the benefit of all who believe. Here's how it works. Jesus has been faithful to God's plan, and his death achieved uniquely the salvation which God always purposed for the human race. What then is to be the badge which says that somebody belongs to that people and is taking full advantage of what was done for them on the cross? The answer is their own faithfulness in the God who has acted in Jesus. So that faith is not an arbitrary badge, as though God just happens to like people who believe things. Rather, faith is what Jesus did in his faithfulness and what we do in believing the gospel and so appropriating what was there achieved for us.